At the roundtable this week, over the past 25 years, Adirondack Architectural Heritage, known as ARCH, has become one of the most successful rural historic preservation organizations in the country. And with us to talk about it is Stephen Engelhardt, the executive director, and also Dr. Howie Kirschenbaum, who is one of the original founders and also the first president and now a board member. Nice to have you both here.
Great to be here.
25 years, does it seem like 25 years?
Well, you know, it does and it doesn't. It's gone by very quickly, but to think back on everything that we've done over those years is just absolutely thrilling and it's wonderful. Yeah.
The Adirondack region was well known for its wild landscapes for so long, and also its conservation effort. That dates back certainly well more than a century. But was it really when your organization came along 25 years ago that many people, historians and communities, started to look at some of these treasures that are in so many of our communities, the architecture?
There had been some local organizations like the Essex Community Heritage Organization and Historic Saranac Lake that had a consciousness about the value of the historic fabric, the built environment in the communities, but there was very little park-wide consciousness of the importance of the architectural heritage. So I think that was one of ARCH's contributions to help bring that awareness throughout the park.
And your mission really became primarily public education and partnering with a number of groups and communities to save these landmarks?
Yeah, I mean, we always had a big emphasis on public education. That's why over the years we've developed a very ambitious and far-ranging, program of tours and workshops and conferences and doing publications. And I think we sort of got into doing partnership work because of opportunities and because that was how you needed to get things done. And so whether it's around Camp Santanoni or around fire towers, that just is how it happened.
Is that one of your major accomplishments through the years, that really you got the public to think about this, that you got them to really come up with plans to save architecture, and that perhaps if you folks hadn't have acted would have been lost?
I think the historic preservation consciousness was growing anyway nationally, but I think ARCH contributed to hastening that and disseminating that around the Adirondacks. And another of the early purposes, is implied by what Stephen said, was advocacy, to be an advocate for some of the endangered historic and architectural treasures of the Adirondacks. And
in many ways, there have been some landmarks that you've really helped to work to save, the Jay Bridge, Camp Santanoni, and others. But there have also been smaller buildings and maybe what would be landmarks that people wouldn't necessarily have recognized or thought that should be saved or preserved.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're very proud of the sort of big, highly visible things that we've saved and been part of, like Santanoni and fire towers, and the Bow Bridge in Hadley over the Sacandaga River is another great example. But there's a lot of smaller projects that don't sort of rise to the level of headlines. And just one example of that might be a little rustic cottage in Old Forge called Hemmer Cottage, which the community was beginning to rally around saving, but didn't quite know how to go about doing it. And through our inspiration and hand-holding, they figured out a way to take the cottage off of its site, which was needed for a school expansion, and to move it to a lakeside location and turn it into a visitor center. And that's just a kind of a smaller project, but there are dozens and dozens of those all over the region.
One of our projects is giving awards each year to projects around the Adirondacks that reflect good stewardship and restoration, and that's where you really see how historic architecture isn't just great camps or major buildings, but it's the theater in Indian Lake or Lake Placid that has restored itself and maintained itself as a community institution. It's this church, it's this old hotel, and so there have been 150 awardees of ARCH's awards program over the years that just is testimony to the variety of interesting and valuable architecture that makes up a community.
And as you mentioned before, is that sense of preserving the community movie theaters and that sense of stewardship. Is that something that is a proud accomplishment for you, that in many ways, as you mentioned, it was growing over maybe the past 25 years, but now to have so many people subscribing to that, is that a major accomplishment for you?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, this is the kind of thing it's really hard to measure, but I think you measure it by, you don't see quite as many buildings that are threatened or being torn down. You see it around the kind of enthusiasm that people, bring to the kinds of projects that we've been describing, and so I think the news is good all the way around.
How many buildings have you helped save in the past 25 years?
Oh gosh.
You lose count.
No idea.
And I think it's a hard question to
Yeah.
answer also, because there's different levels of saving. There's the property owner who comes to us and asks for advice on the right materials to use for a project they would like to do.
And you'll advise them.
Yeah, so that's a small save, if you will. And it runs the gamut all the way to a property that's going to be torn down that we really need to convince people and muster political support to save. So it's a little hard to say.
But over the years, you can look at dozens, if not hundreds, of projects where you have had a hand in either helping a homeowner save a small structure or a camp, and some of the big ones as well. So
Yes,
over the years, there's quite an impact that you've had.
Yeah.
Your level of assistance, and we just talked about it. Many times you offer advice, and we'll help somebody decide whether to save a structure, and you'll help them with the historical significance, all the way up to partnering to work to save a number of structures and landmarks. How do you decide to what degree you get involved?
Well, it partly depends on what people need. I mean, sometimes the phone call or the email exchange is all people need. They need to know that someone is there that's kind of can help them through a process or through a project, and we play that role. Sometimes there's a local group that's fairly well formed and they just need a little help moving something forward. Sometimes we really have to get involved, because as we look out there in the landscape, there's no one else there to sort of take up the cause.
No one step forward.
Yeah.
What
It sometimes takes a conversation with our board of directors to weigh the pros and cons of, should we get involved? Is this close enough to our mission? Could this group do it on their own? Do they need us to really be the co-sponsor of it or not? And so we toss it around, and sometimes we haven't taken on a project, and other times, probably most times, we try to find a way to help.
Was the Old Stone Barracks one of those cases where you felt you had to step forward?
Well, yeah, the possibilities for what might happen there on that property were not good. I mean, there was some dire plans, and I don't know about dire, but there was some things that were proposed there that really would have been inappropriate. And we saw how the community sort of rose up around that, an early plan for the property, and we saw that we could have a role there in helping to bring a group of people together to support, support the work around the barracks and to show some leadership there. And so yes, that was very much part of the
A Montreal developer had purchased the property and had talked about possibly plans of turning it into condos or apartments, and really is when you talk to folks in the community, a lot of them will credit Arch and also the Friends of the Old Stone Barracks, the group that formed, with stepping in and saving that from happening, and saying if it weren't for you folks, that landmark may have been lost.
Yeah, and I think the first thing that we did collectively was we showed the property owner that there was a lot of enthusiasm around the preservation of the building, and to his great credit, he saw this and he said, I don't want to do something there that really the community won't support, and he changed his plans and made it possible for what is now happening to happen.
And you helped facilitate the deal. You brought in another outside owner. They're renovating it now. They plan to open a brew pub and have a working business there, but keep the character of the building, which obviously was important to you folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And the new owners of the building are both come from a military background, and I mean, they just couldn't be happier to see their vision take place in this just remarkably important historic site.
And it has to be so satisfying for you, spending so many years and such an effort on this to now see this play out the way it has.
Yeah, it's great.
One of the things I'm proudest about Arch is that we've tried to work in partnership and cooperatively with the different segments of the community. Unlike some situations where you have confrontations between environmental organizations and local government, somehow we've managed to work in a friendly, cooperative way with all the different constituencies to try to find solutions that are sensitive to the environment, are consistent with the economic development goals of local communities, and work for the average person who wants to appreciate their own cultural heritage in the communities they live in. And so that cooperative, non-confrontational approach, I think, has been characteristic of Arch, and has been one reason why we've been accepted and local constituencies have been willing to work with us.
And has that improved over the years? We hear so much in recent years how there's more of a collaboration on the part of environmentalists and community leaders and others, groups that for many years were at odds, now seem to really be working together on a number of projects. Are you finding that with a number of the projects you're working on as well?
I think that's true. I mean, there's still some issues that separate different constituencies, but I think there's a greater amount of conversation, greater amount of communication and civility, and attempts to find common ground.
And sometimes you would have environmentalists on one side, those in favor of economic development on the other, and I think, are they finding some common ground now where they can find that perhaps preserving landmarks can be a draw for tourism and help boost the economy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in our field, I think what we've shown, over and over and again is that, historic preservation and valuing the region's architecture makes our communities better places to live and to work and to visit, and it all adds up very nicely.
And it's been demonstrated that environmentally, it's much less harmful to the environment to reuse an historic building than to bring all the historic fabric to the dump and start over with new materials that had to be produced with petroleum and so on. So it's environmentalism and historic preservation have much of a common goal that way.
When you talk about projects that some you get more involved than others, back in the 90s, I guess we saw an era where New York State DEC really didn't see much of a need to continue to maintain fire towers throughout the Adirondacks. There were a number of them, and you folks sort of stepped forward with a number of friends groups and really have been one of the driving forces in restoring those towers.
Yeah, I mean, this is an area where you can really see a change in the whole landscape around the appreciation for fire towers. And what had happened is, over the decades and decades that fire towers had been there and been staffed by DC personnel, is that hikers had come to these mountaintops and gone up in the towers and looked at the views and learned something about the natural history from the observer that was there. And so all this public affection had been built up over the years. So when they got closed and when some of them started to be removed, people got spoke up and said, hey, we value these. And so we and others in the region have really been part of showing that passion and showing how they can be restored and used for education purposes and so on.
And in 4 or 5 instances, Arch became the umbrella nonprofit organization to help a local fire tower society or fire tower organization get started. We work with them, and eventually they spun off and became their own independent organization. And we're still, I think we're still involved with about two or three such fire tower groups now.
And one we can see clearly driving up the Northway, just before you get to exit 33, Poco Moonshine, Friends of Poco Moonshine working to restore that tower, and many people now will make that climb up to see that tower.
And this is also a good example of a lot of people involved in fire tower restoration might not see themselves as preservationists. Their primarily interest may be in hiking and an outdoor activity, but this is a way that we've found friends amongst another part of the population, which has
And
been
again,
great.
where many people, a number of people would see an old rusting piece of steel, others saw something worth preserving. And the state has come around within the past few years and has decided in a couple of cases that that those old fire towers can stay.
Yeah, the state has become a very active partner, and is actually, in the case of the two newest towers to be restored, Hurricane and St. Regis Mountains, they're really taking a lot of the initiative and doing the work and really stepping up. Yeah.
And it might be worth mentioning that Arch has about 1,200 members from all towns and villages all around the Adirondacks and beyond, and perhaps some of your viewers would be interested in joining Arch.
I imagine some probably already are, but that's amazing. So 1,200. Of course, you do have more than 100 towns probably across the Adirondack Park that have landmarks and buildings and may reach out for your help from time to time.
Every town has something special in it, for sure.
Were there some lessons learned, hard lessons learned? No. Are there a number of communities now that look back and say, oh, why did we lose that landmark? Why did we lose that building, that community center, that library, that town hall? And now recognize and looking back, wish that they had done things differently.
Well, I'm sure that's happened. As we're talking, I'm trying to think of an example of
good
that.
It's good in a way that one doesn't come right to come right to mind. Were your roots really in Santanoni, the great camp,
I'm sorry, I just thought of an answer to the other. I was having trouble thinking of an example too, and then I remembered of how new owners took over Dexter Lodge in the northern Adirondacks on Dexter Lake, and new owners took over the Warbeak on Upper Saranac Lake, and Arch and other local organizations tried to educate and convince the new owners that these properties were valuable and surely they could implement plans for developing the property around these historic structures rather than instead of them, but they tore them down, and in a year or two they left the Adirondacks, and the communities really regret now the loss of these historic structures. Not that they were themselves responsible for it, but there is a great deal of sense in a number of Adirondack communities, a sense of woe that certain valuable historic resources have been lost.
Yeah, the Warbeak was open, wonderful restaurant there, and then closed to the public, and a lot of people sad to see that. For your roots, were your roots really, did they start with Santanoni and the Great Camp, and the state bought the property back in the early 70s and then just really did very little for 10 or 20 years? Is that really how you came to be?
Yes. At a certain point in around 1990, Paul Malo, another historic preservationist, and I had this sense that there was so much support for saving Camp Santanoni and not allowing it to simply deteriorate or be torn down, but we lacked a constituency, a park-wide constituency to lobby over time for preserving Camp Santanoni. And that was the impetus that formed Adirondack Architectural Heritage. And we got on our first board of directors representatives of different historic preservation local organizations around the Adirondacks and individuals who had been involved in this area, and made Santanoni our first project. But it was clear right from the start that Santanoni was only one example of one type of architecture that needed attention, and so that's how Arch was formed, with a specific goal and a set of general goals at the same time.
And you went on to partner with the state beginning in about 2000 to run Santanoni and to work to preserve it. That still goes on today.
And that's quite a dance to have done that, is to have been sort of advocates for Santanoni, where you could imagine that it might have become adversarial, but because of the way we did the advocacy through, persuasion and education, that once they committed themselves to preserve the camp, we became then partners, and for 15 plus years have have had a great relationship in staffing the site and opening it to the public and doing restoration and stabilization projects, and it's been quite an evolution.
And the partnership included the town of Newcomb, so it was a triumvirate that was really perfect: the statewide, local government, and the nonprofit sector.
And did the state really step up to the plate, and has it continued to fund it to the level where you folks feel it needs to be funded? Outside grants have also been obtained over the years, but is it a challenge every year to keep it where it is and even try to fix it up more, or has the state really been committed?
Well, we've been happy on one level with the state's commitment and interest in the property, but feel it really falls short of what's needed to properly care for a national landmark of Santanoni's stature. So we advocate actively for a separate funding line for Santanoni, which does not exist in the state budget. We advocate for professional staff worthy of a historic site like that. We advocate for more of a commitment to good interpretation and public access to the site. So we think there's a lot of room for improvement, but we are also committed to working with the state and appreciate all that they've done to help get this far.
It's a massive complex, dozens of buildings, and obviously built at a time where now there must be constant upkeep with a lot of those buildings.
We had to make up for 20 years of neglect and deterioration, and I think as of this summer we will have stabilized and put a roof on every single building on the site, and that's good news. That's a real accomplishment, and this amounts to about $2 million worth of work on a couple of dozen buildings, and it's a great accomplishment. Yeah.
About a decade ago, a barn was lost to fire on the property, and plans to eventually rebuild that barn?
Well, ironically, this evening there's going to be a public hearing in Newcomb on the revised unit management plan for Santanoni, and one of the important aspects of the new plan for Santanoni will be the authorization of the rebuilding of the barn. So it's going to be a big fundraising project, but we're excited to think that now it's going to be possible, because we've been advocating that for many years. And every DEC commissioner who's gone to the site has said, oh, we must rebuild the barn, but it hasn't happened. So we hope this new unit management plan will facilitate that occurring.
And that happens every few years, where the unit management plan is updated, revised. Are there a number of things in it that are good and you're encouraged by, including the possibly leading to the rebuilding of the barn? At the same time, there's also a few things in it that concern you.
Yeah, I think generally we're very happy with the plan. There's three things that we think could be improved. One is that we would like to see the ability to do more agricultural open landscape restoration around the farm. And that's tricky because it involves cutting of trees, but it also means fully recognizing that the historic landscape of the Santanoni farm is a value that really should be enhanced and supported. There's also a design for a snowmobile connector trail to come through the Santanoni Preserve, and although we support the idea of having a network of snowmobile trails in the region, we'd like to see eventually a better solution than having the trail come right through the National Historic Landmark. And the third item has to do with the barn subject, and we think there should be some language in there that allows for the rebuilding of other historic buildings that might be lost to fire in the future.
Enhancing the fire prevention.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thousands of people come every year. Are you looking to try to expand on that and ways to improve access to get to the Great Camp?
Well, yeah, I think we've determined that roughly was 11,000 to 14,000 somewhere in there visitors come every year, which is great, and about 2 or 3 times as much as 20 years ago. We still want to have access be by foot and bicycle only, in other words, no motorized vehicles, and as well as the horses and wagons that come in and provide both a great experience and access for handicapped people or elderly people who can't walk the distance. And we hope, we think, we believe over the years, gradually more and more people will want to come, because it is really one of the outstanding and unique state-owned historic sites in New York, and it gets better every year.
And just a brief history for folks that may not know, what would draw them there, and why would they find Santanoni so fascinating?
There's a number of wonderful aspects of Santanoni. One is the architecture of the main camp is this fascinating combination of Adirondack log building and Japanese Shinto temple design. And it's built in the shape of a phoenix, of a bird in flight. It has subtle and interesting architectural elements that make it one of the most important of the Adirondack Great Camps. So that's one of the things that's quite wonderful, that people come on the end of this 4.7-mile hike and come upon this building and are just amazed at its qualities. Another feature is the farm. It was one of their early experiments in agricultural, a gentleman's farm that used modern agricultural, sanitary, hygienic practices, and it was developed by one of the leading farm architects of the time, at the turn of the century, Edward Burnett. And so it's a very unusual early example of a farm in the wilderness that makes Santanoni quite special. And just some of the masonry in all different parts of the camp. There are these masonry arches that are reflect one another in each section of the camp. That's quite fascinating, and it's just full of surprises, the property.
Yeah, and it's rich in stories. I mean, whether it's the story of the Prine family, staying there and the kinds of things that they did, or if it's the stories of the people that worked at the farm, and it's just rich in stories.
And this is the Prine family, the Finch Prine, the paper company family?
If you go back far enough.
Yeah, there were the banking Prines and the lumber Prines, and they are the same family, but a different branch.
And it was a working farm in its day, a huge working farm.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that people experience when they go to Santanoni, you were asking why people visit. I think that it's a kind of a reminder when you visit it about how well buildings and nature can fit together, and that there is a way for these things to come together in a beautiful way. And I think we need to be reminded of that. Yeah.
For the 25th anniversary, what projects are you taking on this year?
One of the things we're doing is we are offering our members and the general public lots of wonderful opportunities to explore the region through our educational programs, and we've kind of amped everything up. And I think we have 40-day-long events, and some of them include traveling by bicycle and food and music, and I think there's some opera in there as well. And so there's a lot of kind of enhanced education stuff, which is just going to be great fun. We're also, a small little book is going to be written this year around kind of looking at Arch's work over 25 years. And that'll be a great way to kind of commemorate what we've done. We've also been putting a lot of new energy into the work at Santanoni, which we've mentioned, and also putting some new energy into trying to bring this historic stone mill that we own in Keysville back to life. And so we have our own organizational preservation project underway too.
And that's your headquarters.
Yeah, it's at our headquarters. Our headquarters consists of the stone office building that we've fully restored, and the stone mill building that goes back to 1849, that we're, as Steve said, getting involved in a bigger way and trying to come up with a solution for that building. So we're going to have a 25th anniversary gala there this summer, and it's going to be a lot of fun. People are going to be able to see this wonderful old mill looking right over the rapids in the Ausable River and have a good time.
And they can go to arch.org and find out all about that. It is a beautiful old stone factory right on the Ausable River, as you mentioned. You're hoping to, as time goes on, renovate it and bring in possibly tenants. A number of businesses sort of set up an incubator for businesses.
Yeah, I mean, we want to do what we hope other people are doing in the communities all across the region, which is seeing the possibilities in a historic building, investing in their time, money, and energy in them, and doing something there that helps to bring the community back to life, or helps to add vitality to the community. And so this is what we're going to do in Keysville.
And if you visit the mill and visit your offices, the headquarters, you can see the history of that mill. It was a nail factory, the Sable Horse Nail Company.
That's right.
From back in the 1800s up until the early 1920s, making nails for horseshoes.
That's right, absolutely.
And,
almost everybody needed them. Yeah.
And obviously, as with the invent of the car and the automobile, probably not as many needed, and eventually it did close in the 1920s.
Yeah, but then it morphed. It became a second factory for a company in Keysville called R. Prescott and Sons, which at that time was making radio cabinets and television cabinets, and then they were in business all the way till the 1960s. It had a second life all the way until the 60s.
And at the same time, so nice that it's such a centerpiece of the village of Keysville to be able to preserve that piece of history.
Yeah.
You mentioned some of the tours. You've always had tours, part of your educational awareness, part of your mission to take tours. You'll go to historic villages, you'll go to some of the landmarks. I think some people may be surprised that some of the tours may not be what they would necessarily think of. For example, the prison in Dannemora.
Right. Well, you asked earlier on about around whether we were sort of formed around the preservation of Santanoni. But I think from almost day one of our jobs was to get people to recognize that there was this whole wonderful breadth and depth of architecture in the region that also deserved our attention and appreciation. So we've designed our outings around bringing people to those sometimes strange and unusual places that really merit our attention, and Dannemora Prison's a great example.
And before someone would dismiss it and say, well, what in the world would we see other than a prison yard and bars, there is incredible architecture there. A chapel, a stone chapel that's part of the original prison, and I think a lot of people would be surprised to take a tour.
Yeah, and it's amazing to go through the prison and eventually to get to this a chapel, the Church of the Good Thief, or St. Dismas, a chapel built out of stone by inmate labor. They built the pews, the stained glass, the trusses, the stencil work in the ceiling. Just a beautiful, peaceful space in the middle of the prison.
And if folks would like to see a schedule of the tours, they can find that on your website, arch.org.
Yeah, and that's aarch.org.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for taking the time to come in and talk with us. We appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.